Hello and welcome to episode 14 of the American Years podcast. I'm Kate Simpson, coordinator of the American Years project. Our project is creating space for and recording the many stories and memories of all the people whose lives were intrinsically linked to the American Navy's presence in the Holy Loch by Dunoon on the west coast of Scotland. In this episode, Margaret Hubbard talks to local ex-school teachers Rhodes and John Kelly about the American children who attended Dunoon Grammar during the American Years.
The Calpeninsula was unique in terms of educating American children. In every other base in the world, American children were educated on the base in the American system by American teachers. However, here in Dunoon Grammar School and in the surrounding primary schools, the children mixed with the local children, bringing with them a rich experience for both groups. In this podcast, we're going to talk to Joe Rhodes, who was the rector of the grammar school throughout the large chunk of the American time here, and John Kelly, who was in the English department. And they are going to interact with one another on stories of the Americans from the point of view of the education of American children in the Scottish system.
Okay, I'm Joe Rhodes, and I was head teacher of grammar school from 1981 on, so for 10 years. In a sense, that was quite good for me because the Americans had been there for 20 years before that, so all the sort of teething problems I didn't have to deal with. And the time I arrived, the Americans were very, very well integrated, not only just into the school but into the area. And not just as far as they were concerned, but also as far as the Scots kids were concerned. So the kids that I saw in the grammar school had had 7 years of primary education before that, and there were a lot of Americans in the primary schools. Mm-hmm. Far more in the primary schools than there were in the secondary school. That's partly because sailors, young men, young families, what have you. I think there are about 400 or 500 youngsters in the primary schools, whereas the secondary school had about 100.
We had about 100, I think, at the most. Yeah.
The tricky bit was, of course, you had 100 this year and 100 next year, but a different 100, because they did 2 years and then they rotated. Mm-hmm. That created a problem, not for the American youngsters, I don't think, because they were so used to it. Many of them had been all over the world. They came from America, they came from Guam, they came from Naples, they came from Germany, they came from all over the world. Mm-hmm. And they were used to 2 years there and move on, 2 years there and move on. But always within the American system. Coming to the Holy Loch was different because they're coming into a Scottish school, and that created its own problems.
Yes. I mean, I came here in 1968, August 68, and from then on, right until the Americans left, I was part of the school. And what Joe's saying is absolutely correct. I would say when I came to the school, I was a brand new teacher, just newly out the box, and there were American kids in school, and I just accepted there were American kids. I didn't suddenly have to adjust to, we've got new Americans, they were here before I was. So. And we only had maybe 2 or 3 at the most in any single class. Yeah. And that was in, big classes like the English classes. And as Joe was saying, they tended to be in the younger year groups. We had very few senior pupils. Mm. And the ones who were seniors, from my recollection, were a good bunch. They were very motivated. They had careers mapped out. They knew what they were wanting to do. They knew where they were going. They contributed quite a bit culturally to the schools. Some of them were very good musicians, remember? Yeah. With a few who played with the school orchestras and the bands, and they brought that sort of thing to us as well.
Two or three reasons why there was a few in the upper school, of course, was that when they went into third year, when our kids went into third year, they were doing a 2-year course. It was O grades then, later to become standard grades. But it was a 2-year course. So let's say the parents transferred in halfway through the third year. There's no way that child could move in and pick up the course. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't possible. So in fact, what happened that from our third year on, American youngsters had the right to go to an American school either at High Wycombe or at Lakenheath, as a FEG basis in England. Mm-hmm. And they went through a sort of boarding school situation in the American system. Those who did stay tended to be able to graduate from American high schools. They had to graduate from American high schools. And they had an American counsellor who was employed by DODS, Department of Defense Schools, the American Armed Forces system, school system, which was huge, absolutely enormous. One thing they had to get was American Constitution and history. That was a mandatory subject among the credits they had to. I think it was 14 credits they had to get. Mm-hmm. A mandatory one was American Constitution and history, and the American Council taught that.
Yes,
and made sure they had that situation covered, that base covered. Mm-hmm. The other thing that created a major problem for the senior youngsters was coming in and trying to pick up British mathematics, which is quite different from American math.
Yes.
Quite different.
Yes.
Well, you start at the same bit, you come out at the same bit, but the routes they took were quite different. So an American youngster would take a credit in calculus, and that would be a block course, or geometry, or whatever, mm-hmm. algebra. Whereas the British system, they would go sort of parallel, they would take it all together. As I say, starting at the same bit, coming out at the same bit, but the routes were quite different.
Yeah.
So a youngster coming in to do American maths could have major problems. They could have done a lot of calculus, done no geometry at all. And of course, we only saw half the problem because they'd had the same problem trying to reintegrate back into the American system.
Yeah.
Mm.
So what happened was that DODS, Department of Defense Schools, employed an American maths teacher. Mm. And that was in my time. So, I mean, for many years before that, that wasn't the case. And he, as it happened to be, taught American mathematics. And from third year on, that group just didn't go to the maths class, went to American maths. And that solved that problem very, very well indeed.
So did he have a timetable? That when the third year went to maths, he extracted the third year Americans and the
and go to American math.
Yeah.
He also did American history, didn't he?
He did American history as well. It used to be it was before that the American counsellor who did that.
Yeah,
but
the counsellor did that.
Joe Evans who did that. Did that, and that worked very well and solved that particular sticky problem which the young Americans had from third year on. But you're right, because there weren't vast numbers from third year on. No. Because the big numbers were primary one right through to secondary. And you still had youngsters who went off to the American schools, preferring just to stay within the American system.
There could have been families that were fragmented then, that the parents sent the child to Lakenheath, but if they had younger siblings, they were in the local primary schools.
Oh yes, that was very common.
That's very common in military families in any nation. Maybe now, I've known British kids have gone through the military system when their parents were posted abroad, and the kids would be sent back to boarding school.
Usually boarding school
in Britain.
I think you'll find a lot of boarding schools with a lot of military families. That was quite common.
What happened on the timetable with the languages? So that if they arrived in second year and it came to French and they'd never done French, what happened to them at that point?
They went to French,
without having done first year French.
That would be a problem. Mm-hmm. Obviously, third year on, it wouldn't be a problem because they just wouldn't do French if that was the case.
That's right.
And we also were aware that they had this language called American English.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
We were conscious not to try and convert. Spelling, some of the structures they used, some of the phrasing, some of their ideas about language were very much American, and there was no sense in trying to reprogram a young American into our English, whatever version of English we spoke in our area. Spellings and things you wouldn't, and occasionally you get quite a lot of good feedback sometimes in some of the younger classes over language and words, and an American would suddenly be tittering at some word we used quite happily. And they was, oh, you can't say that, sir.
It was a different word altogether as far as they were concerned.
Uh-huh.
How did you go on time to teach Burns poetry?
It was no harder to teach an American Burns poetry than to teach an average Scots kid Burns poetry.
Because
The language is just as obscure to a Scot,
Mm-hmm.
in spite of what we claim. You know, Burns was a lowland language, which Joe would speak and I could speak because I'm Kintyre and he was Ayrshire, and we were very much steeped in that. The very language we were not allowed to use in school, in fact, ourselves as youngsters.
But even so, in a lot of the Burns language, I would have had to learn because it had disappeared from music every time I was coming through. Although I was literally on the Burns doorstep.
But the same with Shakespeare in a way, you know, if you're reading a Shakespearean play, where the biggest problem with Shakespeare was where the words seemed the same but had changed meaning, but still existed in modern English in a totally different concept. So, you know, that could be a problem too. But no, they coped with. They coped to most of the things we presented them with. And you were never, I was never particularly aware that pupil A or B was American rather than just a pupil in the class. You know, there were odd ones that, you had ones that stood out, the same as you had Scottish pupils that stood out. Either they were very, very able and you noticed them, or they were the kind that you wished maybe they would be off sick that day.
There's actually various groupings because there were the Americans who came for 2 years. That was the big majority. But you had youngsters whose father had been in the Navy and had retired from the Navy but stayed on.
Yes.
And the kids stayed on. I can think of quite a few families like that. And then you had another group of youngsters whose parents had gone back to America. He'd married a local girl, they married for one reason or other. The marriage hadn't made it, and the family came back without the father. So you had various groupings of Americans, and they all had American accents and what have you, but they weren't necessarily in the American Navy. Talking to a girl in the Osborne last night who was exactly one of these girls.
How long had she lived in America?
She's got an American accent, and she always had an American accent, so she'd be through her formative years. And she came back when she was in lower primary school, lower secondary school, and she's still here. She's still here. With an artist. And,
What would you say was the cultural impact on it all of them, or was there one? Did the PE department, for example, teach baseball?
Not baseball,
no.
But the cultural aspect was basketball became a top sport.
Yep.
Oh, really?
National champions, Scottish national champions.
With Scottish kids playing it?
And a few very good Americans. And again, it was the junior kids, the junior school, not so much as the senior school. Well, what you got was a lot of youngsters coming in who were very, very good basketball players and had played all their lives, which would not be the case with Scottish kids. We also had American coaches come in to take the teams. Young sailors who
come in from the base.
Come in and help out, gladly, and they were very, very good. Now, I'm going to describe to you a cultural situation that happened where it was a real culture clash because American parents were very, very good at supporting their teams. You see that in American films and things like that. Scottish parents rather less so. So American gymnasiums were designed for spectators. You had the bleachers beside it, and the spectators came along and they supported. And you had the cheerleaders, and all that space was given for all of that. So two teams played from different schools. The atmosphere was raucous. Now we got to the Scottish finals, and again, a lot of Americans in it, and the American parents were going to support. It was up to all mess, if I recall rightly. It's a long way with a team of cheerleaders. Which actually would mix American and Scottish girls, all Americans. So up they went, and of course basically Allness didn't know what to do with them because there was no space for them. So they put chairs along the side, literally at the line where the basketball players were playing and where the two referees went up and down. It was a Scottish Cup tie, so it should have been two neutral referees. In fact, one was a PE teacher and one was a 6-year boy who's literally beside these cheering parents who are very noisy. That's what they do. And whatever this 6-year boy thought he knew about baseball, these parents were quite happy to tell him that they knew more. So it was a very the American parents couldn't understand what the problem was because that's what they did. That's what they did. A real cultural class. And eventually the 6-year boy's nerve cracked and he ran. And the rector came down and sort of negotiated, what have you. I got a phone call on Monday saying, what the hell, And I brought in a couple of American parents that I knew very well. I can't think what the problem is, because that's what we do. And we don't in Scotland. We're much more reserved as far as that's concerned.
Yes.
And our facilities, certainly indoor facilities, are just not built for spectators.
No, that's true. That's true.
So that was one I remember, which was where the culture clash was quite evident. If it had been outside in the football pitch, it would be different.
Yes.
But inside, it was a major problem.
The other sport that didn't happen really here under the Americans was American football. But young Americans played soccer.
And they played rugby.
And they played rugby.
They played rugby.
But, quite a few of them took up soccer because there was quite an active, in the early 70s, the Cowboys were Scottish champions.
Yes, they were.
And there were one or two Americans, if I remember. But, a lot of young Americans were quite happy to play soccer at whatever level, whereas none of our lot ever took up American football. I was aware of, because we did have rugby to offer them.
There was no girls' soccer, if I recall rightly. That came later. There was a strong girls' soccer in the 1990s, when the Americans had gone on.
We had a girls' football team when I was in the hostel.
In the hostel?
Yes.
Oh, right.
We had a good girls' football team.
Right. I don't recall one in school.
No. I think some of the girls maybe started one up from some of the hostel girls later, but I mean, there wasn't the opportunity to play too many games anyway, because very few schools had, as far as I'm aware, had girl teams.
No, girls soccer
just wasn't done then.
Much more common now, I think.
Did they blend in, or was there the sense of American exceptionalism in the way they conducted themselves?
You would get a group of Americans who would stick together.
Yes, there would be. Wee sections, probably. I wouldn't say it was a big thing at any time.
It wasn't an issue?
No, and I don't ever remember, and again, maybe it's mists of time, I don't remember any big altercations happening, like, let's go and get the Scots, let's go and get the Americans. There was there'd be the odd barney between a Scot and an American, but it would be two kids fighting rather than...
No, I don't recall any sort of gangs forming or anything like that.
And an awful lot of our own kids, yours would be the same, Joe. A lot of our my two daughters both had American pals, and they spent a lot of weekends staying in American houses.
Any birthday parties would always be with Americans there. Primary school, obviously.
And they picked up a lot of the word cookies and things. They started using American language because they were being well fed at weekends. It was great. It was great.
And was American annual events integrated in any way? I mean, the holiday, Independence Days happened during the school holidays, so it wouldn't matter. But other
things like Thanksgiving.
Thanksgiving is what I'm thinking about.
Tended to be within their own sort of community. I know that these things took place, but not within the school.
And they didn't expect to get Thanksgiving off, a day off. They knew they were meant to be in school that day.
Meant to be in school. Well, they were in school, no matter. I think some of them may well have taken time off. Again, that's a question. I'd have to think about that one, but I can't imagine that if the family was holding a Thanksgiving holiday, some of them just wouldn't have taken a day off. And because we knew it was a national holiday, it wouldn't be chased up.
I would say one of the times that you were probably more aware of American kids was the very odd times over the years when there was a scare at the base. And the ship would have to move. The ship always disappeared down the Clyde if there was any threat. And there would suddenly be an alert, and the American kids were very, very conscious then of personal safety. And
I missed the big one, which was of course the Cuban crisis. It just disappeared, and there's all sorts of stories told. Archie Blair was a principal history, taking a class of senior modern studies kids, and just basically discussing the situation and discussing, just the possibilities. And Brian Wilson, the MP, people sort of said, does that mean we don't have to do our homework tonight? We might not be here tomorrow. So, so that was obviously long before my time, long before your time, John.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember maybe two or three at the most times in my career where the ship sailed and Dunoon wasn't at lockdown, but the Americans, you're suddenly aware of the Americans because they weren't around in the streets, because they were always around in the streets, they used the shops and everything, but they were suddenly very much aware of, hey, we're frontline troops here and we could be targets. And that was long before we had, the kind of terrorism we've experienced in the last couple of decades.
The one I remember was when it was the Libyan raid of 1988, when American planes had left British bases to bomb Tripoli and Gaddafi's regime. And they were definitely expecting repercussions. So I know that all the bases in England were under lock and key, and it was just lockdown. The problem was in Dunoon, which was not behind a wire fence and had no guards. I know there were discussions about what might happen, possibilities of armed guards and what have you. That never happened, and the situation blew over. But obviously, we'll listen to tonight about Lockerbie, the Lockerbie bombing and what have you. It was on the news tonight. The repercussions did take place. Yeah. And it was definitely aimed at Americans. So who knows? Who knows what would have happened? I remember there was a lot of tension about that and a lot of discussion at levels way above me as to what the possibilities might be. I do remember there were opinions made about the rightness and wrongness of American airplanes bombing Tripoli. That was the one. That's the one that I remember most of all in terms of the political situation. Because you got to remember that the kids in the school were not the children of submariners.
Yes.
The submarine crews came in, did their tour of duty, and then they flew back out again through Prestwick. The children were not children of people who were in the submarines. The kids who were in school were people who were children of people who manned the base and who basically serviced the submarines. It was basically a dry dock, and because the submarines were hauled up into the middle of it.
I remember the talk last time I was down here. They were the guys were talking about the submariners as a different breed. They didn't really mix at all. The Navy didn't. The shore-based and the dock-based boys said we didn't mix with the submariners. They looked on them as a kind of different lot. They go out in these tin boxes and disappear for 100 days at a time underwater.
Do you think the local kids benefited from this interaction or not?
Oh, they did. I'm sure they did. I've not a shadow of doubt about it. That you're in this little peninsula in Scotland and you're cut off and what have you, and you have a touch of internationalism which they just would not have got anywhere else. Yep. It was quite unique. Unique. And I think the young Americans benefited too because they saw something different too. Might not have liked everything they saw, but they learned, I think, how to rub along in a situation which they just wouldn't see anywhere else. And they're taking that experience.
Yes.
I'm sure.
And there are still connections. I mean, my daughters are still
many connections.
Still on Facebook connections with some of the young Americans we're in school with. Right.
And there's a lot of family connections. I mean, I know
Yes.
lots of people who got relatives in America through marriages that were 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago. But, so that was definitely a benefit. A benefit.
Funny stories?
You've got lots of funny stories.
There are lots of funny stories, but I don't know how many I'd want to commit to a podcast. Yes. I mean, we had one of the things I remember. Right, I was quite a young teacher at the time, and some of the American youngsters were terribly fond of their teachers, and they would bring us in presents. And they were always bringing. My mum made some cookies and brought some in for you, Mr. Kelly. I said, that's lovely, thanks very much. And there were two wee girls in one of them, I think it was my second year class one year, and they kept bringing in all this food supply for me. We lived under rationing in the war, let's do the martial aid again. But I was getting the stuff, and I said to one of the kids one day, he said, is anything else you would like? And I said, our dad was one of the young officers, and he wore these highly patent black leather, beautiful gleaming shoes. And I said to the kids, humorously, I like these shoes your dad wears. What size are you? I don't really think you could get me some of your dad's shoes because they're military issue. You know, I couldn't be seen walking about in them. Oh, I could ask him. And I came home and told Elaine, and she said, "Oh, for God's sake, when will you learn to behave yourself?"
I was never given cookies. They must have felt you needed feeding up.
I remember I was terribly good looking in those days. How time has flown.
Indeed.
No, they were more forward and more confident in one of the things with the young Americans.
Yes.
You know, the Scots were a more reticent bunch. And, you know, you got to know them. And because I taught in the one school for 35 years, I ended up teaching grandchildren of some of my original pupils. So there was all, you know, a huge family connection with the Scots and the locals. Yeah. But the Americans were very forward. They'd come and chat to you at the desk. They'd come out. They would ask you things a Scot wouldn't dare to ask you. Mm-hmm. You know, very personal questions that they didn't see anything. You know, they wouldn't ask, are you married, sir? Have you got any children? This kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Now, you know, most of the Scots would have known anyway. They didn't have to ask.
I'm aware in the 60s when the Americans came, obviously again, I repeat, I wasn't there, but you'd have found a situation where you'd have a lot of teachers, particularly male, all the male teachers probably were ex-military, a lot of them were.
True.
Fought in the war.
Yeah.
Wore
yes.
gowns, were very formal.
Mm-hmm.
And that must have jarred the Americans quite in because there was corporal punishment.
I was going to ask about that because you must have been teaching there when the belt was still there.
Yes.
I mean, how did they...
I can't remember belting in America. I'm sure I did because I belted Scots. And I don't think if an American did the same thing as a Scot, you'd have belted him too.
Yeah. They certainly asked questions of teachers that, I mean... Mm-hmm. that we wouldn't have dared ask. I don't mean things like, are you married and have you got children? I mean things along the lines of, I don't understand what you've just said. Could you explain it again, please? We wouldn't have dared say that. Uh-huh. We would have struggled on our ignorance. Yeah. And they did ask. Uh-huh. And I was too young to really understand, wonder how these teachers were actually managing that.
Mm-hmm. They also had very little concept of the world outside the States, I think. You know, maybe they came through their own cultural and history teaching and things. You know, what was Scotland actually? Was it an independent nation apart from Britain? Was it some wee colony?
I went to an open day in the base, because they had open days. They were very, very big with their public relations. And I was told quite pointedly on the ship, if there is an alarm, which there may well be, stand still, do nothing, say nothing, don't move. Because these Marines will be armed.
Nice.
And they were swarming all over the place. And just don't mess with them. Here's the quick thing, just don't mess with them. Simple as that. So, they would be used to arms, there's no doubt about that.
Talking of Marines, I'll give you a funny story from way back in the early days, 69, 70. We had a big sponsored walk in the area. The Navy put in a platoon of Marines, and they turned up in full kit. And they were there, all the gear and firearms on the shoulders, and they set off, and within a few miles, a lot of the local kids were catching up and saying, "Do you want me to help you, mister? Will I carry your bag for you?" And they were totally unfit, these guys.
Oh, really?
We were amazed.
That doesn't.
You thought, they'll romp round there, way ahead everybody. They were sitting at the side of the road because they had got soft working on a fairly secure base. They did very little apart from wander around the ship, I suppose, and patrol the base. They weren't out doing the hard stuff.
Slog.
So the Marines surprised us that time. But you didn't see them around much. They were all on the base.
On the base. There were a lot of Filipinos. Again, working in service jobs as far as the... and they were not American Filipinos, they were Filipino Filipinos.
Yes.
I do remember one little girl in the second year who was an absolute gem. And she was a ferociously intelligent girl. And she had been born and brought up in the United States, which her parents had not been. They had come into the Navy system through the base in the Philippines and what have you. So they were not Americans, but their children were. And they came in to talk to me once about their daughter, and she seemed to have aspirations that they didn't think she was fit for. She wanted to be a doctor, basically. And I said, yes, your daughter will make it. I have not a shadow of doubt about that. She is definitely good enough. But their aspirations were so low.
Yes.
To be fair, this doesn't just refer to Filipino parents, it can refer to Scottish parents every bit.
Absolutely.
They were just a quantum leap above what they expected. And they had no idea that this was the case because they just didn't know.
And where did the girl get the aspiration from?
I don't know. Obviously brought up in America and not in the Philippines.
Yeah.
She was getting her aspirations through presumably education. And we were only seeing a couple of years of it. And again, they did the 2 years and they moved on.
Right, okay. Check that it has recorded. We don't have to do it all again.
Oh dear.
Please.
Oh, dear.
I'll go make a cup of tea.
To Ronnie's, it's good night from me.
You have been listening to the American Years Revisited podcast. Huge thanks to Joe and John for taking the time to share their experiences with us. Thank you for listening. See you next time.